Lena Clark, a lonely housewife craving attention, found herself drawn to her charming neighbor, Ethan Daniels. What began as innocent conversation soon spiraled into a deadly affair. As the pressure mounted and secrets grew, Lena's desperate choices would lead to a shocking, irreversible tragedy. 2 lives lost, and her own future forever altered. Lena Clark had always thought of herself as a woman who had it all. Married to Greg Clark, a successful marketing executive, she had a beautiful home in a quiet suburban neighborhood. They lived on Elm Street, a place where everyone knew each other's names and waved as they drove past. It was the kind of town where things seemed to always be calm and predictable. Yet, despite the perfect facade, Lena couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Greg worked long hours, often leaving before sunrise and returning home late at night, his face tired, his thoughts always occupied with the demands of his high-powered job. He was devoted to his work, but it had started to take a toll on their marriage. The once intimate moments, the conversations that had once lasted for hours, had dwindled down to brief exchanges and hollow pleasantries. They still lived under the same roof, but it felt as though they were drifting further apart. Lena had spent so much time alone that she began to question her own worth. She had once been a passionate artist, filled with ideas and creative energy, but that had faded into the background. The art supplies that once littered the living room sat untouched in a corner, covered with dust. In the quiet of her home, Lena began to feel more like a shadow of herself. She spent her days cleaning, making dinner, and waiting for Greg to come home. But there was no joy in these routines, no sense of fulfillment. The spark that once defined her life seemed to be fading, and she couldn't ignore the void growing inside her. She longed for something, someone, who could make her feel alive again, someone who could remind her of who she was before she became just a wife in the background of a busy life. That's when Ethan Daniels moved in next door. He was a breath of fresh air in an otherwise monotonous existence. Ethan, a bachelor in his early 30s, was the opposite of Greg. Where Greg was focused and absorbed in his work, Ethan had a laid-back, easygoing attitude. He had recently moved from a nearby city to start fresh in the small town. He would often be out in his front yard, tending to his garden or washing his car, greeting Lena with a friendly wave whenever she passed by. They started talking casually at first about the weather, their gardens, their pets. Simple exchanges that didn't mean much at the time, but they marked the beginning of a shift in Lena's life. She found herself looking forward to these brief moments with him. Ethan was different from Greg. He listened. He laughed. He made her feel like she was more than just a housewife stuck in a quiet neighborhood. They would chat about their favorite books, movies, and even their shared interest in art. Lena's heart, long dormant, began to feel something she hadn't felt in years. Excitement. It was subtle at first, just a warmth that spread through her when she saw him. But over time, it became undeniable. Ethan had a way of making her feel special, noticed, and important. He made her feel alive in a way that she hadn't felt in so long. As their conversations grew longer, Lena's loneliness began to fade, replaced by the anticipation of seeing him. It was as if her world, which had been stuck in grayscale for so long, was now being colored in vibrant shades. But she didn't yet realize how deeply this newfound connection would affect her life. In Ethan, she had found someone who understood her, someone who seemed to care about her in ways she had been craving for years. What began as innocent conversations quickly turned into something much more complicated. As the weeks passed, Lena found herself drawn more and more to Ethan. Their casual conversations turned into regular meetings, always in the safety of her home, behind closed doors where no one could see. At first she told herself it was nothing, just a friendly bond that was harmless. After all, she had been lonely for so long, and Ethan was simply someone to talk to. But with each passing day she could feel the tension building between them, an unspoken connection growing stronger. It wasn't just the attention he gave her, it was the way he made her feel. When he smiled at her, it was as if he saw something in her that she had forgotten existed. One evening when Greg was working late again, Ethan knocked on her door. He had been helping her with a project in the yard, and they decided to take a break and chat. They sat on the back porch, the summer air warm and comfortable. The conversation started innocently enough, but the subtle glances, the lingering touches, and the way their eyes met seemed to say everything they hadn't yet admitted. Lena could feel her heart pounding in her chest, and she could see in Ethan's eyes that he was feeling the same way. Without thinking, she leaned in slightly, and their lips met in a tentative kiss. It was brief, hesitant, but it was enough to make her stomach flip. For Lena, it was as though something inside her had awakened, something that had been dormant for years. She had never intended for this to happen. But in that moment, it felt as though she had no control over her own desires. The kiss was soft, but the emotions behind it were anything but. It was a release. A floodgate that once opened couldn't be closed again. Ethan pulled away first, his breath shallow, his face a mixture of guilt and excitement. He didn't say anything immediately. They both sat in silence, the weight of what had just occurred hanging between them like a heavy fog. Lena could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, the sound of her own breath filling the air. She wasn't sure what to do, what to say. Part of her wanted to pull away, to tell Ethan that this was wrong, that she was married, that she couldn't betray Greg. But another part of her, the part that had been ignored for so long, wanted more. She hadn't felt wanted in years, not truly. With Ethan she felt alive, desired, and seen. As the days passed, their secret continued. It started with stolen moments, brief encounters in the shadows of the house when Greg wasn't around. Every touch felt like a spark, igniting something deep inside her. The guilt was there, of course, lurking in the back of her mind, but it was overshadowed by the desire for more. Ethan was careful, always making sure no one saw them together, always making sure that Greg was none the wiser. Lena, too, began to lie more often, finding excuses to stay out late or to meet Ethan for a quick drink. She justified it to herself. Greg didn't care about her. He was never around. What harm could it do? But with each passing day, the affair became harder to hide. The lies grew more elaborate, the moments they shared more desperate. Ethan was becoming more demanding, wanting more of her time, more of her attention. It wasn't just a fleeting connection anymore. It was an addiction. And the more she gave into him, the more Lena felt herself slipping away from the life she once knew. What had begun as an innocent escape from loneliness was now a dangerous game with no way out. The fear of being caught, of losing everything, began to gnaw at her. But it was overshadowed by the desire to keep feeling seen, desired, and alive. As Lena's world grew smaller, consumed by her lies and her affair, she became aware of the consequences, but couldn't seem to stop herself. Ethan's presence in her life was now a need, not just a want. The more he pulled her in, the harder it became to think about her life before him. The lines between right and wrong, love and lust, began to blur, and Lena realized she was now living in a world she didn't recognize, a world where she was no longer in control. As the affair deepened, so did the darkness that surrounded Lena's life. Ethan, once the charming and understanding neighbor, began to show a side of himself that Lena hadn't anticipated. His presence, which had once felt like an escape from the loneliness that plagued her marriage, began to feel more like a chain than a lifeline. He wasn't just a man she had fallen for, he was becoming an obsession. Ethan's demands on Lena's time grew more insistent. It was innate enough that she found moments to sneak away from Greg or that they shared stolen kisses. Ethan wanted her to leave her husband. He made it clear in no uncertain terms that he couldn't keep up with their secret affair much longer if she wasn't willing to make a choice. He began to pressure her, convincing her that her life with Greg was nothing but a prison, that she deserved better, that she could have a future with him, one where they would finally be free of the constraints of her marriage. At first, Lena hesitated. She was still torn, conflicted between the life she had built with Greg and the new, unpredictable passion she shared with Ethan. She wasn't sure if she was ready to give up everything she knew, her home, her marriage, even her identity, as she had come to rely on the stability Greg provided, despite his emotional distance. But Ethan was persuasive. He spoke of a new life together, one filled with excitement and passion. He painted a picture of an existence where she could live freely, where she would no longer have to feel invisible, as she did in her marriage. But it wasn't just words. Ethan's behavior toward Lena began to change. The charming, carefree neighbor she had once trusted started showing signs of possessiveness. It began with small things, asking who she had been with when she arrived late, or questioning why she had been away for so long. Lena brushed it off at first, thinking he was just being protective, but as time passed, the questions turned into accusations. He would become angry if she didn't respond to his texts, or if she spent too much time with Greg. Ethan had crossed a line from someone who made her feel special to someone who wanted to control her every move. Lena, caught between guilt and desire, started to feel trapped. The affair, which had once been an exciting escape from her unfulfilled marriage, was now a prison of its own. She found herself lying more often to cover up the truth, weaving a tangled web of deceit that became increasingly difficult to maintain. Every interaction with Greg became strained. Every quiet dinner or evening spent together felt like a facade. Lena couldn't look at him without feeling the weight of her betrayal, yet she was too far in with Ethan to turn back. The guilt gnawed at her. She could see the cracks forming in her relationship with Greg, the man who had once been her world. His indifference toward her had been replaced by a growing suspicion, but he never confronted her directly. Still, Lena could feel the distance between them widening, as though he could sense she was no longer the woman he had married. Ethan, on the other hand, continued to escalate his demands. He would visit her at odd hours, asking her to choose between him and her husband. Each time Lena hesitated, each time she seemed unsure, his frustration grew. He began to push her harder, trying to make her see that she was wasting her life, trapped in a marriage that had no future. The pressure was immense, and the more he pushed, the more Lena began to question everything she had once believed about her life. Could she leave Greg for a future with Ethan? Was she willing to destroy her entire world for a chance at something that might not even last? Ethan's behavior began to slip into dangerous territory. Lena noticed he was no longer the considerate man she had initially found solace in. He was angry, volatile, and unpredictable. He would sometimes lash out over trivial things, blaming her for not being there when he wanted her or accusing her of leading him on. She could feel the tension between them building, but she couldn't find a way to break free from the chaos she had invited into her life. The affair had stopped being a source of pleasure and had become a weight that threatened to crush her. Still, she couldn't let go of Ethan. Despite the fear, despite the doubts, she was too deeply entangled in the mess she had created. Lena's world, once a quiet suburban dream, was now unraveling at the seams. She no longer recognized the woman she had become. The fear of losing everything, Greg, her home, her stability, fought with the desire to be loved, wanted, and free from the life she had settled into. She had fallen for Ethan, but what she didn't realize was that falling for him was the start of her downfall. The tension in Lena's life reached a boiling point one warm summer evening. It was the kind of night where the air felt thick, humid, and almost oppressive. Greg had been working late again, as usual, leaving Lena alone in their large house. She had spent the day in a fog, caught between guilt and the overwhelming desire to feel something other than the emptiness she had come to know. Ethan had been insistent in his calls, urging her to make a decision, to leave Greg, to be with him. It was clear that he was losing patience, and Lena could feel herself slipping further into a corner with each passing day. Ethan showed up unexpectedly at her door, his usual friendly smile replaced by a look of frustration. He was agitated, his eyes wide with a sense of urgency. Lena had been expecting him, but not so soon. He had always been the calm one, the one who made her feel safe and understood. Tonight, however, he was different. The tension was palpable, his words coming fast, his hands shaking slightly as he spoke. He could no longer contain his emotions. "You've got to make a choice, Lena," he demanded, his voice sharp. "I can't keep doing this. I can't keep waiting for you to leave him. You've got to decide now." Lena felt a pit form in her stomach. She had been trying to put off this decision, telling herself that somehow she could fix things, make everything work. But tonight Ethan wasn't going to let her hide anymore. He needed her to choose him. And as he stood in her doorway, his frustration boiling over, she could see that this was no longer about love. It was about control. She tried to explain, tried to tell him that she wasn't ready to leave Greg, that she still needed time to think, but Ethan wasn't hearing any of it. His anger escalated quickly, and before she knew it, he was pacing the room, his hands clenched into fists. He began accusing her of playing games, of leading him on, of wasting his time. Lena had never seen him like this before. So raw, so unrestrained. It was as though the mask he had worn for so long had slipped away, and now she was seeing the man underneath, possessive, demanding, and dangerous. Lena tried to calm him down, but his frustration was building too fast. He was angry, not just at her but at himself for feeling betrayed, for believing that she would leave Greg for him. In a moment of panic, he grabbed her arms, pulling her toward him. The touch was too forceful, too rough. It felt nothing like the gentle embrace she had once sought from him. She tried to pull away, but he held her tightly, his grip tightening as his anger took over. "Why won't you just choose me?" he yelled, his voice filled with pain and fury. "I've given you everything, Lena. Everything." Lena's heart raced as she tried to break free from his grip. Her mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. This was the man who had once made her feel seen, who had offered her a future outside her marriage. And now he was standing before her, a stranger, someone she didn't recognize. The fear that had been growing inside her bubbled to the surface, and her instinct took over. She pushed him away, hard, desperate to escape the situation. But Ethan was relentless. He shoved her back, sending her stumbling toward the kitchen. Lena, in a panic, grabbed the nearest object she could find, an old knife from the counter. She didn't think. She acted. As Ethan lunged at her again, she instinctively swung the knife in defense. The blade made contact, the shock of the moment paralyzing her as she looked down to see Ethan stumble back, his hand clutching his side. Blood began to pool on the floor, a stark contrast against the dim lighting of the room. The realization of what she had done hit her like a freight train. Ethan fell to the floor, his breath shallow, his body twitching slightly in pain. Lena stood frozen, her mind unable to process the events that had just unfolded. She had never intended for things to go this far. This wasn't part of the plan. She had just wanted an escape, a way to feel alive again. But now, as she watched Ethan's life slip away, she realized that she had crossed a line she could never return from. In that moment, everything changed. She was no longer the woman who had been seeking affection. and validation. She was someone who had just taken a life, her lover's life, in a fit of fear and desperation. The house, which had once felt like a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. The walls seemed to close in around her, the weight of the night's events suffocating her. Lena's mind raced, but no solution came to her. There was no escaping what had happened, no pretending it hadn't. Her world had crumbled in an instant, and she was left to face the consequences of her own actions. The minutes following Ethan's collapse were the longest of Lena's life. The silence in the house was deafening, broken only by the sound of her shallow breathing. She stood frozen in place, her heart hammering in her chest, her mind refusing to accept what had just occurred. Ethan lay on the kitchen floor, his once energetic, demanding presence reduced to a lifeless form. The blood spread slowly across the tiles, staining everything in its path. The horrific realization settled in like a weight on her chest. She had just killed someone. Her hand still gripped the knife, trembling as she stared at it in disbelief. Her first instinct was to run, to escape the nightmare she had unleashed. But where would she go? What could she do? She couldn't just leave him there. Her pulse quickened as panic began to set in. Her mind raced, trying to calculate her next move. Should she call for help? What would she even say? How could she explain that this wasn't supposed to happen? She knew the law. She knew what would happen if she called the police. The affair, her lies, everything would come to light, and Greg, her husband, would never look at her the same way again. He'd never understand. The knife fell from her hand, clattering loudly against the tile, and she finally moved, her legs shaky as she stepped toward Ethan's motionless body. She knelt beside him, her hands hovering over his chest. Was there any chance he was still alive? She placed her fingers to his neck, but there was no pulse. The realization hit her like a slap in the face. Ethan was gone, and there was no undoing the damage. The man she had once trusted, who had made her feel alive again, was dead because of her own hands. Tears welled up in her eyes as she looked at him. He had been so full of life, so full of promises and hope. He had convinced her that he could give her a better life, a future away from her lonely marriage. But now, that future was nothing but ashes, destroyed in the blink of an eye. Lena's chest tightened as the weight of what she had done overwhelmed her. She had wanted to feel seen, desired, and free, but in the process she had lost everything that had once been important to her. Greg would be home soon, and the thought of facing him filled her with dread. How could she go on pretending? How could she explain the blood on the floor, the body of the man she had betrayed him with? She didn't know what to do next. She felt trapped, her every decision leading her deeper into a pit she couldn't escape. The guilt gnawed at her, eating away at her insides, but there was no way out now. The one person she had betrayed the most was the one person who didn't deserve this. Time seemed to stand still as Lena looked down at Ethan's body. She wondered what would have happened if she had just walked away, if she had ignored the pressure from Ethan, ignored the pull of his demands. But it was too late for regrets. The man she had once loved, who had made her feel alive and wanted, was now gone, and she was left to face the consequences. She could already feel the walls closing in, suffocating her with the weight of her actions. Her mind swirled with thoughts of running, of leaving the house and disappearing into the night, but something held her back. The image of Greg, of the life they had once shared, flickered through her mind like a fading memory. Could she leave it all behind? Could she live with herself if she did? She didn't know. What Lena didn't realize in that moment was that the horror she felt wasn't just the shock of killing Ethan. It was the realization that in her pursuit of passion and escape, she had lost everything that truly mattered. She had sacrificed love, stability, and trust for a fleeting moment of desire. And now she was alone, facing the consequences of her actions. Her life had crumbled, and there was no way to rebuild it. The choices she had made had led her here, to this point of no return. And as the reality of her situation settled in, Lena understood that the cost of her affair was far higher than she had ever imagined.